I thought spending a few days at home with my younger brother, Evan, would be simple. I didn't expect how much he'd grown, or how much had changed between us. That night, when he knocked on my door, everything shifted. His confession, the way he looked at me, the kiss, hesitant but charged, left me frozen. I should have stopped it, but I didn't. Now, the boundaries between us are blurred, and nothing will ever be the same. I don't know how to move forward, but one thing is certain. There's no going back. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. I never imagined how much a single phone call could dredge up years of buried emotions. But there I was, holding my buzzing phone, staring at Mom's name on the screen. It was the kind of ringtone that made your chest tighten, as if you were about to hear bad news. Mom didn't call often, and when she did, it was rarely for a casual chat. I swiped to answer, already bracing myself for whatever responsibility or errand she needed me to take care of this time. Caleb. Her voice came through warm but hurried, as always. Listen, your father and I need a favor. Evan's going to be alone for a few days. We're leaving for a business retreat, and I don't feel right leaving him by himself. Evan? I asked, the name catching me off guard. It wasn't that I'd forgotten about my younger brother. It's impossible to forget someone you grew up with. But lately, our lives had drifted so far apart that I'd become accustomed to thinking of him as a distant figure, almost like a memory. Yes, Caleb, your brother. There was an edge to her tone, as if she could read my mind. We're leaving tomorrow morning. Can you stay at the house for a few days? Just to keep an eye on him. I know it's short notice, but you're the only one I trust with this. I sighed, glancing out the window of my small apartment. The thought of leaving behind my messy routine to babysit a 17-year-old was far from appealing. I just turned 25, and my life was a chaotic mix of work, missed deadlines, and take-out dinners. Evan, though he was still a kid in high school, what could possibly happen in 3 days? Sure, I said reluctantly. I'll be there. Thank you, sweetheart. I knew I could count on you. Her tone softened, and I could picture her relieved smile. It'll mean a lot to him, too. I wasn't so sure about that. Evan and I hadn't exactly been close over the past few years. I'd gone to college, started a job in the city, and somehow the calls and visits home had grown fewer and farther between. It wasn't intentional. Life had simply gotten in the way. Still, I couldn't shake the faint guilt that lingered whenever I thought about him. Evan and I used to be inseparable. Growing up, we were more than brothers, we were a team, with Mom and Dad always busy. Business meetings, long hours at the office, or traveling for work, I had stepped into the role of Evan's protector and companion. I could still remember the way he used to trail after me as a kid, his small hand clutching mine as we explored the backyard or built forts out of blankets in the living room. He looked up to me back then, his big blue eyes full of trust. I was his world and, in a way, he was mine. But things changed. They always do. College took me away, and with it came a whirlwind of new priorities, new friends, and new challenges. I visited home when I could, but the visits were brief and increasingly awkward. Evan was growing up, too, and the little brother who used to idolize me was now a teenager with his own life, his own friends, and his own routines. We drifted apart, and I wasn't sure how to bridge the gap anymore, or if he even wanted me to. The next day, I packed a bag and made the familiar drive to my parents' house. The 2-hour trip was spent listening to the hum of the radio and wrestling with a mix of apprehension and nostalgia. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same. The neatly trimmed hedges, the white shutters, the familiar oak tree in the front yard. Yet, something about it felt distant, like a relic from another life. I barely had time to knock before the door swung open, and there he was, Evan. Caleb! He greeted me with a grin, his voice a mix of excitement and surprise. Hey, Evan. I forced a smile, taking in the sight of him. He was taller than I remembered, his once boyish frame now more defined. His hair was slightly messy, like he'd been too busy to care, and there was an ease in his expression that took me off guard. "Mom told me you were coming," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "Didn't think you'd actually do it, though. I figured you'd come up with an excuse like usual." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," I replied dryly, setting my bag down in the entryway. He laughed, and it was a sound I hadn't heard in a long time. It reminded me of those summer nights when we used to stay up late watching bad movies and eating popcorn. "Seriously, though," he added, "it's good to see you." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Guilt? Nostalgia? Maybe both. "It's good to see you too," I said finally, meaning it more than I expected. We spent the rest of the evening catching up. Well, mostly Evan talking while I listened. He told me about school, his plans for college, and the ridiculous pranks his friends had pulled recently. His voice was animated, his gestures lively, and for the first time in years, I saw a glimpse of the kid I used to know. But there was something else, too. A quiet maturity, a confidence that hadn't been there before. It was a subtle shift, but I couldn't ignore it. As the night wore on and the conversation lulled, I found myself studying him more closely. His laughter was deeper, his posture straighter. He wasn't the little brother who used to follow me around anymore. He was someone new, someone I didn't quite recognize, and it left me feeling strangely unsettled. "Guess I'll head to bed," Evan said eventually, standing and stretching. "Long day tomorrow." Mom and Dad left a list of chores a mile long. "Of course they did," I said, smirking. He grinned, the kind of grin that could disarm anyone, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. "Good night, Caleb," he said softly before heading upstairs. "Good night," I replied, watching him disappear around the corner. I sat there for a long time after he left, the silence of the house pressing in around me. My thoughts drifted to the years we'd lost, the bond we'd let slip away. I didn't know what the next few days would bring, but one thing was clear. Evan wasn't a kid anymore, and for reasons I couldn't quite explain, that realization left me feeling both proud and uneasy. The next morning, I woke to the faint scent of coffee drifting upstairs. For a moment, I forgot where I was. The soft murmur of distant birds and the glow of sunlight slipping through the blinds felt foreign, too peaceful compared to the noisy chaos of my city apartment. Then it hit me, I was home. After a quick stretch, I made my way downstairs, where Evan was leaning casually against the kitchen counter, a mug in hand. He looked up when he heard me approach, flashing a sleepy grin. "Morning, Caleb. Coffee's ready," he said, lifting his own cup as if to emphasize the point. I blinked at him, trying to reconcile the teenager in front of me with the kid I used to make breakfast for every morning. Now here he was, brewing coffee like he owned the place. "You drink coffee now?" I asked, a teasing edge to my voice. Evan rolled his eyes. "What, you thought I'd still be guzzling chocolate milk? I'm practically an adult, you know?" "Practically," I replied, pouring myself a mug and taking a sip. It wasn't bad, strong, a little bitter, but better than I expected. "Not bad for a high schooler." "Thanks," he said, smirking. "I've had a lot of practice keeping myself awake. Between school, homework, and dealing with Mom's chore lists, I barely have time to breathe." "You sound like you're 40, I said, laughing. He chuckled, setting his mug down on the counter. "Well, someone has to keep things running around here when Mom and Dad are off doing whatever it is they do." The way he said it wasn't bitter, exactly, but there was a faint edge to his tone. It reminded me of how I used to feel when I was his age. Left behind, overshadowed by their endless stream of meetings and business trips. "Yeah, I get it," I said quietly. "They've always been like that. It's not easy." Evan shrugged, brushing it off. "It's fine. I'm used to it. Besides, I've got things under control." He sounded confident, but I couldn't help wondering if there was more to his casual demeanor than he let on. Later that day, as I unpacked my things in the guest room, my old bedroom had long since been turned into Mom's craft room, I heard Evan outside mowing the lawn. Peeking out the window, I watched him for a moment, his movements methodical as he worked. The kid I remembered would have done everything he could to avoid chores like that, but this version of Evan didn't seem to mind. He was so different now.
Taller.
Leaner, with a confidence in his stride that felt almost unfamiliar. It wasn't just his physical growth, it was the way he carried himself, the way he spoke. He seemed more self-assured than I'd ever been at his age. Shaking off the thought, I finished unpacking and headed downstairs just as Evan came inside, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Done already?" I asked, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge and tossing it to him. "Yup," he said, catching the bottle with ease. He twisted the cap off and took a long drink before leaning against the counter. "You know, I don't mind doing this stuff. It's kind of relaxing." "Relaxing? Mowing the lawn?" I raised an eyebrow, laughing. "Don't laugh," he said, grinning. "It gives me time to think. And it's better than sitting inside all day, staring at a screen." I shook my head, amused. "You're officially weird, Evan." "And you're officially old, Caleb?" he shot back, smirking. We both laughed, the sound filling the kitchen in a way that felt strangely right. It reminded me of the easy camaraderie we used to share before life got in the way. For a brief moment, the years of distance between us seemed to melt away. That evening, we settled into the living room with dinner, pizza, because cooking wasn't exactly in my skill set, and turned on the TV. Evan flipped through the channels before landing on one of our old favorites, a cheesy action movie we'd watched a dozen times as kids. "Remember this?" he asked, settling into the couch beside me. "Of course," I said, taking a bite of pizza. "You made me watch it so many times. I can still quote half the lines." "Yeah, well, it's a classic," he said, his tone light. "Besides, it's way better than the stuff they make now." As the movie played, I caught myself glancing at him from time to time. He was so at ease, laughing at the corny dialogue and mouthing the lines he still remembered. Watching him, I felt a pang of nostalgia for the days when this kind of thing was our routine. It was strange, being back here after so long, but it wasn't bad. In fact, for the first time in years, I felt like I'd come home. The second day started quietly, with the kind of stillness that only existed in this house. I woke earlier than I expected, the morning sunlight spilling through the thin curtains. For a moment, I lay there, letting the calm settle over me. It wasn't a feeling I got often in the city, where the noise of cars and people bled into everything. I finally rolled out of bed, padding down the hall toward the kitchen. Evan was already there, as I suspected, sitting at the dining table with a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him. He was scrolling through his phone, earbuds dangling around his neck. "Morning," I said, grabbing a plate and helping myself to some of what he'd cooked. "Morning," he replied without looking up, though there was a slight smile on his face. I sat down across from him, balancing the plate on one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. The silence between us was comfortable, punctuated by the occasional scrape of a fork on a plate. "So, what's the plan for today?" I asked eventually. Evan shrugged, putting his phone down. "I dunno. I was thinking we could go out for a bit. You know, get some fresh air, maybe check out the park." Surprised me. I'd expected him to want to spend the day holed up in his room or hanging out with friends, but he seemed genuinely interested in spending time together. "Yeah, sure," I said. "It's been a while since I've been to the park." "Cool," he said, smiling before turning back to his food. Later that afternoon, we made our way to the park. It was the same one we used to visit as kids, though it looked a little different now. The trees were taller, the paths more worn, and the playground equipment had been replaced with sleek, modern structures. Evan led the way, walking with an easy confidence that seemed so natural for him now. I found myself watching him as we strolled, struck again by how much he'd grown. He was taller than I was now, though not by much, and his movements had a kind of grace that made him seem older than his 17 years. We found a bench near the pond and sat for a while, watching the ducks paddle lazily through the water. The conversation flowed easily, just like it had the night before. "So," Evan began, leaning back and stretching his arms along the back of the bench, "tell me more about your job." You never really talk about it when Mom or Dad ask. I shrugged, picking at a loose thread on my sleeve. There's not much to tell. It's just work. Same thing every day. Meetings, deadlines, spreadsheets. You know how it is. Sounds exciting, he said, smirking. Oh, it's thrilling, I replied, rolling my eyes. Seriously, though, it's not bad. It pays the bills. Evan studied me for a moment, his expression thoughtful. You don't sound like you love it. I don't hate it, I said quickly, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. He tilted his head, his gaze steady. That's not the same thing. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I looked out at the water instead. The truth was, Evan wasn't wrong. I'd taken the job because it seemed like the practical thing to do, but I hadn't felt passionate about anything in years. What about you? I asked, shifting the focus to him. Any plans for after high school? Yeah, actually, he said, brightening. I've been looking at a few colleges. I'm thinking about studying architecture. Architecture? I echoed, surprised. Yeah, I've always liked building stuff, you know? And I'm good at math, so it feels like a good fit. That's really cool, Evan. I didn't know you were into that. He shrugged, a faint blush creeping into his cheeks. I don't really talk about it much, but I've been working on a few designs in my free time. Just sketches, mostly. I'd love to see them sometime, I said, and I meant it. Maybe, he said, smiling. The walk back to the house was quieter, though not in a bad way. It felt like we'd said everything we needed to for the moment, and the silence was filled with the rustle of leaves and the crunch of gravel beneath our feet. By the time we got home, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. Evan headed upstairs to shower, leaving me alone in the living room. I sank into the couch, flipping through the channels until I landed on a comedy special. A few minutes later, Evan reappeared, his hair damp and his face freshly scrubbed. He dropped onto the couch beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. What are we watching? He asked, grabbing a throw pillow and hugging it to his chest. Some stand-up thing, I said. It's supposed to be funny, but so far, it's just kind of weird. He laughed, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Sounds like your kind of humor. I nudged him with my elbow, and he nudged me back, the playful gesture so familiar it made my chest ache a little. We ended up watching the whole special, laughing until our sides hurt. It felt good, better than I'd expected, to just be here with him, laughing at stupid jokes like we used to. As the credits rolled, Evan turned to me, his expression softer now. Hey, Caleb. Yeah? Thanks for staying. It means a lot. I looked at him, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. Of course, Evan. You're my brother. That's what I'm here for. He smiled, but there was something in his eyes I couldn't quite place. Something that lingered in the air even after we both said goodnight and went to our rooms. The third day started with an odd sense of routine. I woke up late this time, hearing the hum of the vacuum from downstairs. By the time I made my way to the kitchen, Evan had already cleaned up, a stack of dishes drying on the rack and the smell of fresh pancakes lingering in the air. You really went all out, I said, spotting a plate of pancakes covered with foil on the counter. Evan leaned in the doorway of the living room, dressed in a fitted t-shirt and joggers, his hair still slightly damp from a shower. He held a rag in one hand and a smirk on his face. What can I say? I figured you needed a break from all the takeout. Plus, it's not like you're any good at cooking. I chuckled, grabbing a plate and serving myself. Well, thanks, I guess. He stood there for a moment watching me eat, his gaze lingering just long enough for me to notice. It wasn't the kind of look I was used to. It felt weighted somehow, like he was observing me too closely. I brushed it off, focusing on my food instead. What are you doing today? I asked between bites. He shrugged, walking into the room and leaning against the counter across from me. Not much. Thought we could hang out again. Maybe watch something later. That's your plan? To just hang out all weekend? I teased. What? You got somewhere better to be? He shot back with a grin, though there was something playful in his tone that made me hesitate for a split second. No, not really. I admitted, smirking. Exactly, he said, his grin widening. So, you're stuck with me. That afternoon, we settled on the couch to watch a movie. A comedy we'd seen 100 times before. The jokes were predictable, the lines familiar, but it didn't matter. It was the kind of humor that reminded me of easier times, and I caught myself laughing along with Evan like we were kids again. At one point, during a particularly ridiculous scene, Evan leaned closer, his shoulder pressing against mine as he laughed. It was a small gesture, something I might not have noticed a few days ago, but now it felt different. I shifted slightly, giving him more room on the couch, but he didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. When the movie ended, we sat in comfortable silence, the credits rolling across the screen. I glanced over at him, and for a moment, he seemed lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the blank television. "You okay?" I asked. He blinked, turning to me with a faint smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking." "About what?" He hesitated, his fingers brushing over the hem of his shirt. "Nothing important." I didn't push him. Something about the moment felt fragile, like a thread pulled too tightly. Instead, I leaned back, letting the quiet fill the space between us. Later that evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, I caught Evan watching me again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The way his gaze lingered, the faint flush in his cheeks when I turned to look at him. "Something on your mind?" I asked, half joking as I wiped down the counter. He shook his head quickly, looking away. "No. Just, thanks for helping." It was an odd response, but I didn't press him. I figured he was just tired or distracted. Still, the tension was there, humming just beneath the surface, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between us. That night, as I sat in my room scrolling through my phone, I heard a quiet knock on the door. "Come in," I called, expecting Evan. Sure enough, he appeared in the doorway, his hair messy from running a hand through it and his expression unreadable. "Hey," he said softly. "You busy?" "Not really," I replied, setting my phone aside. "What's up?" He hesitated, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "I just wanted to talk, I guess." There was a weight in his voice that caught me off guard. "What's on your mind?" I asked, sitting up straighter. He crossed the room slowly, sitting on the edge of the bed. For a moment, he didn't say anything, his hands resting on his knees as he stared at the floor. "It's just, we haven't really talked in a long time," he began, his voice quiet. "And I guess I've been thinking about it a lot lately, like how much I've missed this, having you around." His words hit me harder than I expected. "Evan," he shook his head, cutting me off. "I know it's not your fault. You had to go to college and you've got your own life now. But it just feels like I lost you, you know? Like you were the only person who ever really got me and then you were gone." I didn't know what to say to that. The guilt I'd been carrying for years suddenly felt crushing, and I hated that I'd made him feel this way. "I'm sorry," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to make you feel like that." He looked up at me then, his eyes bright with something I couldn't quite place. Sadness, maybe, or relief. "I know. I just needed to say it." For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. "Anyway," he said, breaking the silence, "I guess I should let you get some sleep." "Evan," I said quickly, reaching out before I could stop myself. He paused, glancing back at me, and I saw it again. That look in his eyes, the one that made my chest tighten. "Good night, Caleb," he said softly before slipping out of the room. I sat there long after he left, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I'd come here thinking it would be a simple visit, a chance to reconnect and help out for a few days. But now I wasn't so sure. Something was shifting between us, and I couldn't tell if it was real or just my imagination. Either way, I couldn't ignore the feeling that things were changing, whether I was ready for them to or not. The house was quiet again that night, the kind of stillness that settles in after everyone's gone to bed. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying Evan's words from earlier in my head. You were the only person who ever really got me, and then you were gone. The weight of his voice clung to me like a shadow. I hadn't realized how much my absence had affected him, or maybe I had and just never let myself dwell on it. I'd always been the one who left, who moved on to the next stage of life, assuming everyone else would adapt. But Evan had been left behind. The knock at the door startled me, soft and hesitant like the night before. I already knew it was him. "Yeah," I called, sitting up as the door creaked open. Evan stood there, silhouetted by the faint light from the hallway. He looked like he'd been pacing. His hair was a little messy, and he had the sleeves of his sweatshirt pushed up as if he'd been fidgeting with them. "Can I come in?" he asked softly. I nodded. "Yeah, of course." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and sat on the edge of my bed like he had the night before. This time, though, he didn't avoid my gaze. His eyes met mine, and there was something raw in them, something that made my chest tighten. "Evan," I started, but he shook his head. "Just let me say this first," he said, his voice quiet but steady. I closed my mouth, waiting. He rubbed the back of his neck, letting out a shaky breath. "I've been thinking about this for a long time, probably too long, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever say it. But you're here now, and I can't keep pretending like it doesn't matter." I frowned, trying to piece together what he meant. "What doesn't matter?" He hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of the mattress. "How I feel about you." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unmistakable. My breath caught, and for a moment, I wasn't sure I'd heard him right. "Evan?" I started again, but he pressed on, his voice gaining a desperate edge. "I know it's wrong," he said quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I know it doesn't make sense, but I can't help it. You've always been the one person who makes me feel safe, like I'm not alone. And I know you probably don't feel the same way, and that's fine, but I needed you to know." He stopped, his shoulders rising and falling with each breath, and suddenly, the room felt too small. I stared at him, my mind racing to process what he'd just said. There was so much to unpack, so many emotions tangled up in his confession, but all I could focus on was the raw vulnerability in his voice. I trailed off, shaking my head. "Evan, this is a lot to take in." "I know," he said quickly, standing up as if he was preparing to leave. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "Wait," I said, grabbing his wrist before he could turn away. He froze, his eyes wide as he looked down at where our skin touched. "Don't go," I said softly. "Please, just give me a second." He nodded, sitting back down slowly, though he still looked like he was ready to bolt at any moment. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my thoughts. "Evan, you're my brother. You'll always be my brother. And I don't want you to feel like you have to hide anything from me. Ever." His expression faltered, and for a moment, I thought he was going to cry. "So what does that mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I know I don't want to lose you. And if this is how you feel, then I want to understand it. I want to understand you." The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncertain. But when he finally met my gaze, there was something softer in his expression, a flicker of hope that made my chest ache. "Thank you," he said quietly, and the sincerity in his voice was enough to break whatever tension had been lingering. "Always," I said, offering a small smile. He stayed a little longer after that, the conversation shifting to lighter topics, memories from our childhood, funny moments we'd shared. By the time he left, the knot in my chest had loosened, though my mind was still spinning with everything he'd said. I didn't know what the next day would bring, but one thing was certain. Nothing between us would ever be the same again. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the faint patterns of moonlight spilling across the ceiling, replaying Evan's words over and over in my head. "I can't help it. You've always been the one person who makes me feel safe." His voice had cracked when he said it, and the rawness of the confession lingered like a ghost in the room. I'd always thought of him as my kid brother, the boy who used to follow me everywhere. But after tonight, that version of Evan felt impossibly distant. This Evan, older, more self-assured yet deeply vulnerable, was someone I didn't quite know, and that unsettled me in ways I couldn't explain. I tried to focus on logic, on rationalizing everything he'd said. He was 17, still figuring things out. Maybe these feelings were temporary, a passing phase born out of loneliness or misplaced attachment. But even as I thought it, I couldn't shake the memory of the way he'd looked at me. So certain, so exposed. The soft knock on my door snapped me out of my spiraling thoughts. I sat up, my pulse quickening. It was late, far too late for casual conversations, but I already knew who it was. "Come in," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. The door creaked open, and Evan stepped inside. He was wearing an oversized hoodie and sweatpants, his hair messy from sleep, but his eyes were wide and alert, filled with something I couldn't quite name. "Hey," he said softly, lingering near the doorway. "Did I wake you?" I shook my head. "No, I was already up." He hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Can I sit?" "Of course." I moved to the side of the bed, making room for him. He crossed the room slowly, the floorboards creaking under his weight, and perched on the edge of the bed. For a moment, he didn't say anything, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, me neither," I said, leaning back against the headboard. "A lot on my mind." "Same," he murmured, glancing down at his hands. The silence between us stretched, heavy and charged. I could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken weight of everything he'd said earlier hanging between us. I wanted to say something to break it, to ease the discomfort, but no words came. "Caleb," he said suddenly, his voice trembling. "I meant what I said earlier. I know it probably freaked you out, and I'm sorry for dumping all of that on you, but I needed you to know. I've been holding it in for so long, and I just—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Evan," I began, but he cut me off, his words rushing out in a torrent. "I know you don't feel the same way. I know it's not normal or whatever, but I couldn't keep pretending like it wasn't there. I couldn't keep pretending like I don't care about you more than I should." His voice cracked on the last word, and he looked away, his shoulders tense and his jaw tight. I swallowed hard, my mind racing to find the right thing to say. The vulnerability in his voice, the desperation in his words. It was impossible to ignore. "I don't know what to say," I admitted finally, my voice quiet but steady. "This is a lot, but I don't want you to feel like you have to apologize for how you feel. You're allowed to feel whatever you feel, Evan. I'm not mad, and I'm not freaked out." He turned to me then, his eyes wide and filled with a flicker of hope. "You're not." "No," I said firmly. "I'm not." The relief on his face was palpable, and for a moment, the tension in the room seemed to ease. But then he shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine, and the charged silence returned. "Evan," I said carefully, my voice tinged with warning. He didn't move away. Instead, he reached out, his hand trembling slightly as it rested on mine. "Just tell me to stop," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "If this is too much, just tell me, and I'll stop. I swear." My breath caught, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thick. I should have pulled away, should have told him to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I sat there, frozen, my mind and body at odds. "Evan." His name came out as a whisper, and before I could say anything else, he leaned in, closing the distance between us. The kiss was brief, tentative, and trembling with uncertainty. His lips barely brushed mine before he pulled back, his eyes searching my face for a reaction. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to feel. Shock, confusion, guilt, or something else entirely. But the look in his eyes held me captive. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, his voice shaking. I shouldn't have. Stop, I said, cutting him off. My voice was sharper than I intended, and he flinched. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Evan, this is complicated. I don't know what to do with this, but I don't want to hurt you. You're my brother, and I trailed off, the words sticking in my throat. He nodded, his expression crumbling. I get it, he whispered.
I'm sorry.
I'll go. But as he moved to stand, I grabbed his wrist, stopping him. Wait, I said softly. He froze, looking at me with a mix of hope and fear. Just give me a second, I said, my voice barely audible. He sat back down, his gaze fixed on me, and I could feel the weight of his emotions pressing down on me. I didn't know where this would lead, but one thing was clear. We had already crossed a line, and there was no going back. The morning sunlight poured through the thin curtains, washing the room in a muted golden hue. I opened my eyes slowly, blinking against the light, and for a moment, everything felt normal, quiet, peaceful. But then the memories of last night came rushing back, and the knot in my stomach tightened. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts churning like a storm. I replayed everything. The knock on my door, Evan's trembling voice, his confession, the kiss. My chest felt heavy with a mix of guilt, confusion, and something I didn't want to name. What had I done? I hadn't stopped him. That was the part one couldn't shake. I should have pulled away, drawn a clear line, but instead, I'd hesitated. And in that hesitation, everything had changed. I groaned, running a hand over my face. This wasn't supposed to happen. I'd come here to reconnect, to mend the distance between us, not to make things more complicated. But now, I wasn't sure if I'd made things better or irreversibly worse. When I finally made my way downstairs, the house was eerily quiet. Evan wasn't in the kitchen, and the faint hum of the TV suggested he was in the living room. I found him sitting on the couch, his legs pulled up beneath him and a blanket draped over his shoulders. He was flipping through channels absently, his eyes glued to the screen but not really watching. Morning, I said, my voice rough from sleep. He glanced up at me, his expression unreadable. Morning, he replied softly, his tone careful. I lingered in the doorway for a moment, unsure of what to say. The tension between us was thick, and I could feel it pressing down on my chest. You hungry? I asked finally, falling back on something neutral. He shrugged. Not really. Right? I said, rubbing the back of my neck. I'll, make coffee. He nodded but didn't say anything else. I moved into the kitchen, the silence following me like a shadow. As I brewed the coffee, I kept glancing toward the living room, my mind running through a dozen possible ways to approach the situation. I knew we needed to talk about what had happened, but the thought of actually saying the words out loud made my stomach churn. When the coffee was ready, I poured 2 mugs and carried them into the living room. Evan looked up as I set one down on the table in front of him. Thanks, he murmured, wrapping his hands around the mug but not drinking. I sat down on the other end of the couch, the distance between us feeling both necessary and unbearable. For a while, neither of us said anything, the soft noise of the TV filling the silence. Evan, I said finally, breaking the stillness. He turned to me, his eyes cautious. Yeah, we need to talk about last night, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the nerves coiled in my chest. His expression tightened, and he looked away, his grip on the mug tightening. I know, he said quietly. I need you to know that I care about you, more than anything. I began, choosing my words carefully. But what happened? It can't happen again. His jaw clenched, and I could see the hurt flash across his face. But he nodded. I get it, he said, his voice barely audible. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. This doesn't change how I feel about you, Evan. You're my brother, and I'll always be here for you. I don't want you to feel like you can't talk to me or be honest with me. Okay. He nodded again, but the tension in his posture didn't ease. I know, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to stop feeling this way. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. How could I? There was no easy answer, no simple way to fix this. I don't have all the answers, I said finally, my voice soft. But we'll figure it out. Together. He looked at me then, his eyes glassy, and for the first time since last night, I saw a flicker of something that looked like hope. Okay, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We sat there for a while, the silence between us no longer as suffocating. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was a start. The following day, the air between us felt lighter, though the unspoken tension was still there, lingering at the edges. It wasn't as sharp, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. I could see it in the way Evan avoided meeting my eyes for too long and in the way he'd laugh at my jokes but then quickly look away, as if afraid he'd let too much show. Still, we were trying. That much was clear. After breakfast, I suggested we go for a walk. The house was starting to feel too small, the walls pressing in on me with every passing hour, and I figured the fresh air might do us both some good. Evan hesitated at first, fiddling with his phone like he was trying to come up with an excuse to stay behind, but eventually he relented. Yeah, okay, he said, slipping on his sneakers. Let me grab my jacket. The neighborhood park was quieter than it had been the other day. A few families strolled along the paths, and a couple of kids were chasing each other near the playground, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Evan walked beside me, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his gaze fixed on the ground in front of him. For a while, neither of us said anything. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under our feet and the distant chatter of the park's other visitors. I wasn't sure how to start the conversation, but I knew I needed to. How are you holding up? I asked finally, keeping my tone casual. He shrugged, his shoulders lifting and dropping in one fluid motion. I'm fine. You don't have to pretend with me, I said, glancing over at him. He sighed, kicking a small rock off the path. I don't know, Caleb. I'm trying, but... He trailed off, his brow furrowing. But it's not that easy, I finished for him. Yeah, he said softly, his voice barely audible over the rustle of the wind. We reached the pond and stopped near the water's edge. Evan crouched down, picking up a smooth, flat stone and tossing it into the water. It skipped twice before sinking, the ripples spreading out in concentric circles. I don't want things to be weird between us, he said suddenly, his gaze fixed on the pond. I don't want you to feel like you have to tiptoe around me or treat me differently because of what I said. I leaned against the wooden railing, watching him. I don't want things to be weird either, Evan, and I'm not going to treat you differently. But we do need to figure out how to move forward. For both our sakes. He stood up, brushing his hands off on his jeans. And what if I can't? You can, I said firmly. It's not going to happen overnight, but you can. You're strong, Evan. Stronger than you think. He scoffed, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You sure about that? Yeah, I am, I said, meeting his gaze. I've watched you grow up, Evan. I know how much you've been through, how much you've had to figure out on your own. You're a lot tougher than you give yourself credit for. His expression softened, and for a moment, he looked like the kid I used to know, the one who used to believe me when I told him everything was going to be okay. Thanks, he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. The walk back to the house was easier, the silence between us less strained. Evan seemed lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, even if just a little. When we got back, he went up to his room while I stayed downstairs, scrolling through my phone and half watching some crime drama on TV. I wanted to give him space, let him process things at his own pace, but part of me couldn't stop thinking about our conversation. Later that evening, he joined me in the living room, a notebook in hand. Hey, he said, sitting down beside me. Hey, I replied, glancing at the notebook. What's that? He hesitated for a moment before holding it out to me. Sketches. For the architecture stuff I was telling you about. I took the notebook, flipping through the pages carefully. Each one was filled with intricate designs, buildings, bridges, even a few interior layouts. The attention to detail was incredible, and I found myself genuinely impressed. "Evan, these are amazing," I said, looking up at him. "Seriously, you've got real talent." His cheeks flushed, and he rubbed the back of his neck. "Thanks. It's just something I do to pass the time." "You should take this seriously," I said, handing the notebook back to him. "You could do something with this. I mean it." He smiled, a small but genuine smile, and for the first time in days it felt like things might actually be okay. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself thinking about how much Evan had changed, how much we'd both changed. There was still a long way to go, and I knew things wouldn't magically fix themselves overnight. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were headed in the right direction. The last morning of my stay came quicker than I expected. I woke to the sound of rain tapping softly against the windows, the gray skies casting the house in a dim, muted light. My bag sat in the corner of the room, already packed and ready for me to leave later that afternoon. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at it, feeling the weight of the past few days settle over me. So much had changed in such a short time. Evan and I had started to bridge the gap between us, but it was clear that our relationship would never be the same. Part of me felt relief that we'd faced what we needed to, but the uncertainty of what came next lingered in the back of my mind. When I finally went downstairs, Evan was sitting at the dining table, a mug of coffee in his hands. He looked up as I entered, his face a mix of emotions I couldn't quite read. "Morning," he said softly. "Morning," I replied, pouring myself a cup and sitting across from him. The silence between us was comfortable but tinged with something bittersweet. It felt like we were both trying to savor the moment, knowing it would be one of the last before I left. "So," he said after a while, breaking the quiet, "you're heading back today?" "Yeah," I said, nodding. "I've got work tomorrow." He stared down at his coffee, his fingers tracing the rim of the mug. "I'm gonna miss you." His words hit me harder than I expected. "I'll miss you too, Evan," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He looked up at me then, his eyes glassy but steady. "Do you think things will be different between us?" "They already are," I admitted. "But that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. We're figuring it out, right? And I'll be here for you, Evan. I mean that." He nodded slowly, a small, hopeful smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Thanks. That means a lot." We spent the rest of the morning together, playing video games and laughing like we hadn't in years. It felt almost like old times, almost, but there was an unspoken understanding between us now, a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had passed. By the time I was ready to leave, the rain had stopped, though the sky was still overcast. Evan walked me out to the car, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Drive safe," he said, his voice soft. "I will," I replied, opening the driver's side door. I hesitated for a moment, then turned back to him. "Hey, Evan." "Yeah. Take care of yourself, okay? And call me if you need anything. Anytime." He smiled, though there was a sadness in his eyes that made my chest ache. "I will. Promise." With one last glance, I climbed into the car and started the engine. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw him standing there, hands still in his pockets, watching me go. It wasn't the goodbye I wanted. It felt incomplete, like there were still so many things left unsaid. But I told myself we'd have time to figure it out. As the house disappeared from my rearview mirror, I couldn't help but wonder what the future held for us. Things were different now, and I wasn't sure if they'd ever go back to the way they were. But for the first time, I felt like we were moving forward, together. It had been a week since I left the house, but the weight of those 3 days still lingered like a shadow over everything I did. Back in the city, life moved on, as it always does, emails to answer, meetings to attend, deadlines to meet. But no matter how busy I kept myself, my thoughts would inevitably circle back to Evan. The house felt so far away now, like another world. Yet, at the same time, It stayed with me, vivid in my memory. The sound of Evan's laugh, the way he'd looked at me with a vulnerability I wasn't sure I deserved, the quiet tension that hummed between us in those unspoken moments. I leaned back in my office chair, staring at the ceiling as the weight of everything pressed down on me. Could we ever go back to how things were before? Was that even possible anymore? I didn't know. I thought about calling him, my hand hovering over my phone more times than I cared to admit. Every time I hesitated. What would I even say? How could I talk to him without acknowledging the enormous thing sitting between us? Still, the silence felt worse. Finally, late one evening after work, I gave in. I tapped his name on my screen and held my breath as the phone rang. It didn't take long for him to answer. "Hey, Caleb," he said, his voice lighter than I expected. "Hey," I replied, exhaling slowly. "How's everything going?" "Not bad," he said. "Same old stuff. School, chores, mom nagging me about college applications." He laughed softly, and it eased something in my chest. "That sounds about right," I said, leaning back on the couch. "She always loved her checklists." "Yeah, no kidding," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. For a moment, we sat in silence, the quiet hum of the phone line filling the space between us. But this time, it didn't feel so heavy. "I've been thinking about what you said," I admitted finally. Evan didn't say anything right away, but I could hear him breathing on the other end. "Yeah?" he asked softly. "Yeah. I don't know where we go from here. Evan, I don't have all the answers. But I meant what I said. I'm here for you, no matter what." His breath hitched, and when he spoke, his voice was steadier than I expected. "Thanks, Caleb. That means more than you know." After we hung up, I sat there for a while, staring at my phone. The conversation wasn't perfect. It didn't magically fix everything. But it felt like a start, like we were finding our way forward. I still didn't know what the future held for us. There were so many questions I couldn't answer, so many lines we'd crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. But I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't let the distance grow between us again. Whatever came next, we'd face it together.